To our amazing viewers at Cheating Tales Lab, we'd love to hear, which part of the world are you joining us from? Let us know. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation of Trust. Detective Robert Bobby Sinclair had built his life on three pillars: justice, loyalty, and family. After 15 years with the Chicago PD, he'd seen enough betrayal to know its true cost, yet somehow believed his own fortress was impenetrable. His wife, Christine, had been his college sweetheart, a kindergarten teacher with warm brown eyes and a laugh that could disarm the most hardened criminal. Their son, Timothy, was 8 years old with Bobby's stubborn streak and Christine's gentle heart. Bobby's reputation in the department was legendary. He'd never let a case go cold, never backed down from a threat, and never forgave those who crossed him. His partner, Detective Lisa Rodriguez, often joked that Bobby held grudges like other people held their breath, tightly and for far too long. But it was this very trait that had made him one of the most successful detectives in the city. When Bobby Sinclair wanted justice, he got it, no matter how long it took or what lines he had to cross. The Sinclair household seemed perfect from the outside. Their suburban home on Maple Street was immaculate, with Christine's garden blooming year-round and Timothy's bicycle permanently stationed by the front porch. Bobby worked long hours, but he never missed Timothy's baseball games or Christine's school events. He believed in being present, in showing up when it mattered. Christine taught at Riverside Elementary, where she'd worked for 7 years. She was beloved by her students and respected by her colleagues. Her principal, David Morrison, often praised her dedication and creativity in staff meetings. What Bobby didn't know was that David's praise had become increasingly personal over the past 2 years. David Morrison was 42, divorced, and ambitious. He'd taken the principal position at Riverside 3 years ago, bringing with him a reputation for turning around struggling schools. He was handsome in a polished way, with silver-streaked hair and expensive suits that set him apart from the typical educator. More importantly, he was manipulative, a skill that served him well in both his professional and personal conquests. The affair had started innocently enough. Late-night planning sessions for school events, conversations that lingered after faculty meetings, shared lunches that gradually became more intimate. Christine had been vulnerable. Bobby's demanding job meant he was absent more often than present, and she'd begun to feel like a stranger in her own marriage. Bobby, meanwhile, had been tracking a series of brutal home invasions across the South Side. The cases consumed him, each crime scene revealing a pattern that suggested the perpetrator wasn't just stealing. He was studying his victims, learning their routines, their weaknesses. It was the kind of case that kept Bobby awake at night, poring over evidence and building profiles. He never suspected that while he was hunting monsters in the shadows, his own home was being invaded by a different kind of predator. Timothy adored his father, often waiting by the window for Bobby's car to pull into the driveway. The boy had inherited Bobby's sense of justice, often standing up for smaller kids at school and asking pointed questions about right and wrong. He also had an uncanny ability to read people, a trait that would prove crucial in the days to come. One evening in late October, Timothy came home from school with an unusual story. He told Bobby that Mr. Morrison had been asking him questions about their family, what time Daddy came home, whether Mommy got lonely, if they ever went on trips together. Bobby's detective instincts should have triggered, but he was distracted by a break in his case. A witness had come forward, and Bobby was convinced he was finally closing in on the home invasion suspect. Christine's behavior had been shifting subtly for months. She'd started working later, attending more school functions, and her phone had become a constant companion. When Bobby asked about her day, her responses were detailed but felt rehearsed, as if she'd practiced them. She'd also begun suggesting that Bobby take more weekend trips with Timothy, claiming she needed alone time to grade papers and plan lessons. David Morrison was playing a longer game than Christine realized. His divorce had cost him half his assets, and he'd been methodically researching Christine's family finances. Bobby's detective salary was substantial, but more importantly, Christine's father had recently passed away, leaving her a significant inheritance that she hadn't yet accessed. David saw an opportunity for both emotional and financial gain, but he needed Bobby out of the picture permanently. The plan David conceived was intricate and relied on his understanding of human psychology. He'd studied Bobby's case files, learning about the detective's methods and obsessions. David knew that Bobby's greatest strength, his relentless pursuit of justice, could be turned into his greatest weakness. All it would take was the right motivation and the perfect crime scene. Chapter 2. The Architect of Deception. David Morrison's manipulation of Christine had been a masterclass in psychological seduction. He'd identified her vulnerabilities, loneliness, feeling undervalued, craving intellectual stimulation, and systematically exploited each one. Their affair wasn't just physical. David had made Christine feel seen in ways Bobby's demanding career had prevented. The principal's office became their primary meeting place. David had installed new locks and security cameras that he controlled personally, ensuring their privacy. He'd convinced Christine that what they were doing was justified, that Bobby's neglect had pushed her into his arms. More insidiously, he'd begun planting seeds of doubt about Bobby's character, suggesting that a man who could be so cold to criminals might not be capable of true warmth at home. Bobby's latest case had taken a disturbing turn. The home invasion suspect, a man named Carl Brennan, had escalated to murder. The most recent crime scene showed signs of torture, and Bobby was convinced Brennan was building towards something even worse. The case file consumed his dining room table, photographs and evidence bags scattered across every surface. Christine had stopped complaining about the mess, which should have been Bobby's first clue that something was wrong. Timothy had been having nightmares, something he confided to his mother, but not his father. In his dreams, he was trapped in a dark place, calling for help but unable to make anyone hear him. Christine had taken him to the school counselor, conveniently, someone who reported directly to David Morrison. The counselor, Dr. Patricia Wells, was young and eager to please her boss. When David asked her to document Timothy's concerning behavioral patterns, she complied without question. David's plan required careful timing and an understanding of Bobby's psychological profile. He'd researched the detective's past cases, noting Bobby's tendency to become obsessively focused when children were involved. David also knew that Bobby had grown up in foster care after his own parents died in a car accident when he was 10. The detective's fierce protectiveness of Timothy wasn't just paternal, it was deeply personal. The school's Halloween carnival provided David with the perfect opportunity to advance his scheme. As principal, he was responsible for organizing the event, which meant he controlled the volunteer schedules, security arrangements, and venue access. More importantly, he knew Bobby would be working that night, pursuing a lead on the Brennan case. Christine had volunteered to run the face-painting booth, a decision David had carefully influenced. He'd arranged for them to have access to the school's basement storage area, where they could be alone without interruption. What Christine didn't know was that David had been preparing the basement for weeks, installing equipment that would serve a very different purpose than their romantic encounters. Timothy loved the Halloween carnival, particularly the haunted house that the older students created each year. This year, David had taken special interest in the attraction, personally overseeing its construction in the school's basement maze. He'd convinced the student organizers to make it more elaborate than ever before, with multiple rooms and hidden passages that few people besides himself knew about. On the night of the carnival, Bobby received a call from his informant. Carl Brennan had been spotted in a warehouse district on the south side, and Bobby's captain had authorized a raid. Bobby kissed Christine goodbye, ruffled Timothy's hair, and promised to be back before the carnival ended. He had no way of knowing that David had orchestrated the tip through a network of contacts he'd cultivated during his previous job as a social worker in the same district. David's background wasn't what he'd led the school board to believe. Before becoming an educator, he'd worked as a clinical social worker specializing in child psychology. He'd left that position under circumstances he'd carefully omitted from his resume. Several families had filed complaints about his inappropriate interest in their children, and one had threatened legal action. David had managed to resign before a formal investigation could be launched, but the experience had taught him valuable lessons about manipulation and the vulnerabilities of family systems. The carnival was in full swing when David made his move. He'd given Timothy special VIP access to the haunted house, telling the boy that he could go through as many times as he wanted without waiting in line. Timothy was thrilled, especially when David personally escorted him to the basement entrance, explaining that there was a secret passage that only the principal knew about. Christine was busy with face painting when David sent word that Timothy needed her in the basement. He'd gotten scared in the haunted house and was asking for his mother. Concerned, Christine abandoned her station and hurried downstairs. What she found instead was David, waiting for her in a storage room with champagne and dimmed lights. He'd orchestrated Timothy's disappearance to create this moment, but he hadn't told Christine that part of the plan. When Christine asked where Timothy was, David assured her that the boy was fine. He was helping the older students reset the haunted house between groups. Christine relaxed, allowing David to pull her into his arms. Neither of them noticed the small camera David had positioned to capture their encounter, or the fact that Timothy was much closer than either of them realized. Chapter 3: The Web Titans. Timothy had indeed gotten lost in the haunted house, but not in the way David had planned. The 8-year-old had discovered one of the hidden passages David thought only he knew about, and had been exploring the basement's maze-like storage areas when he heard his mother's voice. Following the sound, he'd found a ventilation grate that allowed him to see into the room where Christine and David were embracing. The boy was too young to fully understand what he was witnessing, but he knew instinctively that it was wrong. His mother was kissing Mr. Morrison the way she kissed Daddy, and they were saying things that made Timothy's stomach hurt. When David began unbuttoning Christine's blouse, Timothy crawled backward through the ventilation system, desperate to escape what he was seeing. David's plan was progressing perfectly, except for one crucial element he hadn't accounted for: Timothy's intelligence and resourcefulness. The boy had inherited Bobby's investigative instincts and had been unconsciously cataloging the strange interactions between his mother and the principal for weeks. Now, hiding in the dark basement passages, Timothy began connecting dots that most adults would have missed. Meanwhile, Bobby's raid on the warehouse had been a bust. Carl Brennan wasn't there, and Bobby was beginning to suspect that the tip had been deliberately false. His informant was nowhere to be found, and the warehouse showed no signs of recent activity. Bobby's instincts were screaming that something was wrong, but he couldn't pinpoint what. He decided to cut the surveillance short and return to the carnival. Christine and David's encounter in the basement storage room lasted only 20 minutes, but it was long enough for David to accomplish his real objective. While they were together, he'd been recording their conversation and had maneuvered Christine into saying things that could be taken out of context. When she mentioned feeling trapped in her marriage and wishing she could start over, David carefully prompted her to elaborate, all while the hidden camera captured every word. Timothy had managed to find his way out of the basement through a maintenance exit, emerging behind the school near the parking lot. He was dirty and shaken, but his first instinct was to find his father. He'd left his jacket in the haunted house and was cold, but more than that, he needed Bobby to make sense of what he'd witnessed. When he couldn't find Bobby at the carnival, Timothy did something that would later prove crucial. He called 911 from the school's office phone. The 911 call was logged at 9:47 p.m. Timothy told the dispatcher that his mother was in trouble and that he couldn't find his father. The dispatcher, following protocol, attempted to locate Bobby through the police radio system. By coincidence, Bobby was already driving back from the failed raid when he received the call. His blood ran cold when he heard that Timothy had called for help, and he immediately radioed his location and requested backup. David had no idea that Timothy had witnessed anything or that the boy had called the police. He was still in the basement with Christine when they heard footsteps on the stairs. Christine assumed it was Timothy looking for them, but David recognized the heavy, purposeful tread of police boots. In a moment of panic, he made a decision that would seal his fate. He activated a fire alarm and began shouting for help, claiming that he and Christine had been trapped in the basement by a malfunction in the door lock. Bobby arrived at the school to find fire trucks and police cars already on scene. The carnival had been evacuated, and chaos reigned in the parking lot as parents searched for their children. Bobby's first priority was finding Timothy, but the boy was nowhere to be seen. It wasn't until the fire department cleared the basement that Bobby learned Christine and David had been rescued from the storage room. The story David told was elaborate and well-rehearsed. He claimed that he and Christine had gone to the basement to retrieve supplies for the carnival when the door lock had malfunctioned, trapping them inside. When the fire alarm went off, they'd been forced to break down a secondary door to escape. Christine corroborated the story, though she seemed shaken and avoided making eye contact with Bobby. Timothy was found 20 minutes later, hiding in Bobby's police car in the parking lot. The boy had used Bobby's spare key, which he'd seen his father hide under the wheel well. When Bobby found him, Timothy was wrapped in Bobby's emergency blanket from the trunk, and his eyes held a haunted quality that made Bobby's detective instincts flare to life. The ride home was tense and quiet. Christine sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, while Timothy curled up in the back seat, pretending to sleep. Bobby kept glancing in the rearview mirror, noting that Timothy's breathing was too controlled for actual sleep. Something had happened at that carnival, something that all three of them were processing differently. That night, after Christine had gone to bed, Timothy came to Bobby's home office. The boy stood in the doorway for a long moment before climbing into Bobby's lap, something he hadn't done in over a year. When Bobby asked what was wrong, Timothy whispered, "Daddy, what would you do if someone was hurting Mommy?" The question sent ice through Bobby's veins, but before he could respond, Timothy had fallen asleep in his arms. Bobby sat in his office until dawn, holding his son and staring at the case files scattered across his desk. Carl Brennan's photographs seemed to mock him from the evidence boards, but Bobby was beginning to realize that the real monster might be much closer to home. As the sun rose over Maple Street, Detective Robert Sinclair began planning an investigation that would either save his family or destroy it completely. Chapter 4: The Detective's Awakening. Bobby's investigation began the way all his cases did, with methodical documentation and careful observation. He started a new case file, one that would never see the inside of a police station. The subject was his own family, and the potential crime was one that cut deeper than any murder he'd ever investigated. The days following the carnival revealed subtle changes in the household dynamic. Christine had become hyper-vigilant, jumping at unexpected sounds and checking her phone obsessively. She'd also started being overly affectionate with Bobby, cooking his favorite meals and initiating conversations about their future together. To an outside observer, it might have looked like a renewed commitment to their marriage. To Bobby, it felt like guilt. Timothy's behavior had changed as well. The boy had become clingy, reluctant to go to school, and asking repeatedly when Bobby would be home. He'd also started having trouble sleeping, often wandering into Bobby and Christine's bedroom in the middle of the night. Most telling was Timothy's reaction whenever David Morrison's name was mentioned. The boy would go rigid and find an excuse to leave the room. Bobby's partner, Lisa Rodriguez, noticed the change in him immediately. Bobby had always been intense, but now he seemed distracted, losing focus during interviews and missing details that would normally catch his attention. When Lisa asked if everything was okay at home, Bobby deflected with questions about the Brennan case, but Lisa wasn't fooled. She'd been Bobby's partner for 8 years and had never seen him rattled by anything. The breakthrough came when Bobby was reviewing Timothy's 911 call. He'd requested the recording from dispatch, claiming it was related to a security assessment for the school. Listening to his son's frightened voice, Bobby heard something that made his blood run cold. Timothy hadn't just said his mother was in trouble. He'd said, "Mr. Morrison is with Mommy, and they're doing bad things." Armed with this information, Bobby began conducting surveillance on his own family. He installed hidden cameras in their home, using equipment from the police evidence locker that was scheduled for disposal. He tracked Christine's movements, logged her phone calls, and began building a timeline of her activities. What he discovered was a pattern of deception that had been ongoing for months. Christine's affair with David Morrison was extensive and well-documented once Bobby knew what to look for. Hotel receipts charged to David's credit card, cell phone records showing hundreds of calls and texts between them, and photographs from David's social media that showed Christine in the background at school events, always positioned just close enough to suggest intimacy. But Bobby's investigation revealed something more disturbing than adultery. David Morrison's background check had been cursory when he was hired at Riverside Elementary. Bobby's deeper dive revealed the complaints from David's previous job, the families who had accused him of inappropriate behavior with their children, and the suspicious circumstances of his departure. David wasn't just a cheating spouse. He was a predator who had systematically targeted Christine and, by extension, Timothy. The hidden cameras in Bobby's house captured conversations that made his suspicions concrete. David had been visiting their home during Bobby's work hours, and his interactions with Timothy were inappropriate by any standard. The man had been questioning Timothy about his father's work schedule his mother's habits, and the family's financial situation. Most disturbingly, David had been grooming Timothy, using techniques that Bobby recognized from his training in child psychology. Bobby's discovery of David's true nature triggered something primal and dangerous. This wasn't just about adultery anymore. It was about a predator who had infiltrated his family and was using his wife's vulnerabilities to gain access to his child. Every protective instinct Bobby possessed screamed for immediate action, but the detective in him knew that careful planning would be more effective than righteous fury. Lisa Rodriguez finally cornered Bobby in the precinct parking lot, demanding to know what was going on. Bobby had always trusted Lisa implicitly, and he found himself telling her everything. Lisa listened without judgment, her own parental instincts engaging as Bobby described David's behavior toward Timothy. When Bobby finished his account, Lisa asked one simple question: "What do you need me to do?" Together, Bobby and Lisa began planning an operation that would exist entirely outside official channels. They couldn't involve child services or the district attorney's office without concrete evidence of David's crimes against Timothy, and they couldn't trust that the school administration would take appropriate action given David's position. They needed to create a situation where David would reveal his true nature while protecting Timothy from further harm. The plan required Bobby to appear unsuspecting while gathering evidence that would destroy David both personally and professionally. Lisa would provide technical support and surveillance assistance, using her contacts in the cybercrime division to access David's digital communications. Most importantly, they would use Bobby's knowledge of criminal psychology to manipulate David into making mistakes. Bobby's first move was to schedule a meeting with David Morrison under the guise of discussing Timothy's recent behavioral issues at school. He played the concerned father perfectly, asking David for advice about Timothy's nightmares and reluctance to attend school events. David, confident that his manipulation of Christine had made him untouchable, agreed to the meeting eagerly. During their conversation, Bobby observed David carefully, noting the man's body language and verbal patterns. David's questions about Timothy were probing and inappropriate, focusing on the boy's fears and vulnerabilities rather than his academic progress. Most revealing was David's suggestion that Timothy might benefit from one-on-one counseling sessions in his office, sessions that David would personally conduct. When Bobby expressed concern about Timothy's 911 call on the night of the carnival, David's demeanor shifted subtly. He became defensive, claiming that Timothy had been confused and frightened by the fire alarm. David suggested that Bobby might want to consider therapy for Timothy, hinting that the boy's overactive imagination could become problematic if not addressed. Bobby agreed to consider David's recommendations, all while mentally cataloging every word for future use. The meeting ended with David offering to increase his personal attention to Timothy's case, promising to monitor the boy's emotional state and provide regular updates to Bobby and Christine. Bobby shook David's hand and thanked him for his dedication, all while imagining the many ways he would make the man pay for what he'd done to their family. Chapter 5. The Hunter Becomes the Hunted. Bobby's counteroperation against David Morrison required a level of deception that pushed every ethical boundary he'd ever maintained. But with Timothy's safety at stake, Bobby found that his moral compass pointed in only one direction: total destruction of the threat to his family. Lisa Rodriguez had proven invaluable in the technical aspects of the investigation. Using her cybercrime contacts, she'd gained access to David's personal computer and discovered a cache of photographs and videos that confirmed Bobby's worst fears. David had been documenting his interactions with Timothy and other children at the school, creating what appeared to be a catalog of potential victims. The evidence was damning, but it had been obtained illegally and couldn't be used in court. Bobby's plan required David to incriminate himself in a way that would be admissible and undeniable. He began by feeding David false information through Christine, using his wife's affair as a conduit for his deception. Bobby started working later hours and scheduling out-of-town trips, creating opportunities for David to become bolder in his pursuit of both Christine and Timothy. Christine, unaware that Bobby knew about her affair, began bringing David to their home more frequently. Bobby's hidden cameras captured every interaction, building a comprehensive record of David's behavior. More importantly, the recordings showed David's increasing comfort with boundary violations, both with Christine and Timothy. The psychological manipulation required Bobby to become someone he'd never been, a man who could smile at his wife's betrayer while planning his destruction. Bobby studied David's patterns obsessively, learning his schedules, his habits, and his weaknesses. David's arrogance would be his downfall. The man had become so confident in his control over the situation that he'd stopped being careful. Timothy had begun confiding in Bobby about Mr. Morrison's visits to their house. The boy was clearly uncomfortable with David's presence, but hadn't known how to express his feelings. Bobby encouraged these conversations, validating Timothy's instincts while carefully gathering information about David's behavior. Timothy's accounts revealed that David had been asking the boy to keep secrets about their interactions, a classic grooming technique that made Bobby's rage burn hotter. Lisa Rodriguez had been conducting her own investigation into David's past, using police databases and contacts in other jurisdictions. What she discovered painted a picture of a serial predator who had been moving from position to position, leaving a trail of victims and suspicious circumstances. David Morrison had perfected his technique over years of practice, using his authority and charm to manipulate both children and their parents. The evidence Lisa uncovered included sealed juvenile records, employment files with suspicious gaps, and testimony from witnesses who had been too afraid to come forward during previous investigations. David had been careful to avoid prosecution, but he'd left enough of a pattern that law enforcement could connect him to multiple cases of child endangerment and sexual misconduct. Bobby realized that David's infiltration of his family was part of a larger pattern. The predator had specifically targeted families where the father was absent due to demanding work schedules, creating opportunities to manipulate both mothers and children. Christine wasn't David's first victim, and Timothy wouldn't be his last if Bobby didn't stop him. The plan Bobby conceived was intricate and merciless. He would use David's own psychological techniques against him, creating a trap that would expose the predator's true nature while protecting Timothy from further harm. The operation required perfect timing and complete commitment, but Bobby was prepared to sacrifice everything to ensure his family's safety. Bobby's first move was to stage a conversation with Christine about a fictional work trip that would take him out of town for several days. He made sure David overheard the discussion through Christine's phone call, knowing that the predator would see the opportunity as irresistible. David's response was immediate. He offered to check on Christine and Timothy while Bobby was away, positioning himself as the helpful family friend. Lisa Rodriguez established surveillance positions around the Sinclair house, using unmarked vehicles and concealed cameras to monitor David's activities. Bobby would actually remain in town, coordinating the operation from a command post they'd established in an abandoned warehouse on the south side. The location was chosen specifically because it was where Carl Brennan, Bobby's original case target, had been conducting his own criminal activities. The night before Bobby's supposed departure, he sat with Timothy and had the most important conversation of his life. He explained to his son that Mr. Morrison was a bad man who had been trying to hurt their family, and that Daddy was going to stop him. Timothy listened with the serious expression of a child who understands that the adult world contains real monsters. Bobby hugged his son tighter than he ever had before and made a promise that would guide everything that followed. "No one will ever hurt you again, Timothy. Daddy will make sure of that." The 8-year-old looked up at his father with complete trust and whispered, "I know, Daddy. You're the strongest person in the world." As Bobby prepared to leave for his fake trip, he took one last look at his family home. By the time he returned, everything would be different. David Morrison would be exposed, Christine would face the consequences of her betrayal, and Timothy would be safe. Bobby had spent his career pursuing justice for strangers. Now he would pursue vengeance for his own blood. Chapter 6. The Trap Springs. Bobby's fake departure was executed with theatrical precision. He loaded his suitcase into his car, kissed Christine goodbye in full view of the neighbors, and drove away as if heading to the airport. Instead, he circled back to the surveillance post Lisa had established 3 blocks from his house. From there, he could monitor David's movements while maintaining complete deniability about his true whereabouts. David Morrison took the bait within hours of Bobby's supposed departure. He arrived at the Sinclair house at 7 p.m., ostensibly to check on Christine and Timothy. Lisa's surveillance cameras captured his arrival, and Bobby's hidden house cameras documented everything that happened inside. David's behavior immediately crossed professional boundaries. embracing Christine too intimately, and asking Timothy invasive questions about his feelings regarding his father's absence. Timothy played his role perfectly, having been coached by Bobby on how to respond to David's manipulation attempts. When David suggested they play special games that would be their secret, Timothy pretended to be interested while actually recording the conversation on a device Bobby had given him. The 8-year-old's courage in the face of a predator was both heartbreaking and inspiring to Bobby, who watched from the surveillance post with murder in his heart. Christine's behavior revealed the full extent of her betrayal. With Bobby gone, she allowed David to openly act as the man of the house, discussing plans for their future together and even suggesting that Timothy might be happier with a new daddy who could spend more time with him. Bobby recorded every word, building an archive of evidence that would destroy any chance of reconciliation. The situation escalated when David attempted to get Timothy alone. Using the excuse of helping with homework, David suggested they go to Timothy's bedroom while Christine prepared dinner. This was the moment Bobby had been waiting for, clear evidence of David's predatory intent toward his son. Lisa received the signal and began moving surveillance units into position for the arrest. Timothy had been trained for this exact scenario. When David closed the bedroom door and began asking inappropriate questions about Timothy's body and feelings, the boy activated a panic alarm Bobby had given him. The silent signal transmitted directly to Bobby's phone, confirming that the trap had been sprung. Within minutes, Bobby was moving toward his house with Lisa and a team of backup officers. David's true nature emerged fully when he realized Timothy was resisting his advances. The mask of friendly principal dropped, replaced by the cold manipulator Bobby had suspected him to be. David's threats toward Timothy were captured on multiple recording devices, providing evidence that would end his career and likely his freedom. The predator had finally revealed himself completely. Bobby's entry into his own house was swift and devastating. He used his key to enter silently, moving through rooms he knew better than anyone while David remained focused on Timothy. When Bobby appeared in the bedroom doorway, David's shock was absolute. He had believed completely in Bobby's departure and hadn't prepared for this possibility. The confrontation between Bobby and David was brief but decisive. David attempted to claim innocence, suggesting that Timothy had misunderstood his intentions, but the recordings made denial impossible. Bobby's rage was carefully controlled, channeled into cold precision rather than hot fury. He wanted David to understand exactly what was happening and why. Christine's arrival in the bedroom completed the tableau. She found her husband holding David at gunpoint, while Timothy stood protected behind Bobby's massive frame. Christine's attempts to defend David died when Bobby played back the recordings of David's threats toward Timothy. The sound of her lover threatening her son broke something fundamental in Christine's psyche. Lisa Rodriguez and the backup team arrived to find the situation completely under control. David Morrison was arrested on charges of attempted child endangerment, stalking, and violation of his position of authority. The evidence Bobby and Lisa had gathered ensured that David would face federal charges as well, given his pattern of behavior across state lines. But Bobby's plan was far from complete. David's arrest was only the beginning of a carefully orchestrated campaign of vengeance that would destroy every aspect of the predator's life. Bobby had spent weeks studying David's finances, relationships, and vulnerabilities, preparing to dismantle the man's entire existence piece by piece. As David was led away in handcuffs, Bobby whispered something in his ear that made the predator's face go white with terror. "This is just the beginning," Bobby said quietly. "I know everything about you, David. Every secret, every weakness, every person you care about. You touched my family, and now I'm going to destroy yours." The night ended with Timothy safe in Bobby's arms, Christine facing the reality of her choices, and David Morrison beginning to understand that he had targeted the wrong family. Detective Robert Sinclair had spent 15 years learning how to hunt predators. Now he would use every skill he'd acquired to ensure that this particular monster never hurt another child. Chapter 7. The Reckoning begins. The immediate aftermath of David Morrison's arrest sent shockwaves through the Riverside Elementary community, but Bobby's campaign of vengeance had only just begun. While David sat in a holding cell awaiting arraignment, Bobby activated a network of contacts and resources that would systematically dismantle every aspect of the predator's life. Lisa Rodriguez had spent the past week documenting David's financial irregularities, discovering that the principal had been embezzling funds from the school's budget to finance his lifestyle and his pursuit of vulnerable families. The evidence was solid enough to add federal charges to David's growing list of legal problems, but Bobby wanted more than just imprisonment. He wanted complete destruction. Timothy's resilience in the face of trauma amazed everyone who worked with him. The boy had been interviewed by Child Protective Services and victim advocates, all of whom praised his courage and clarity in recounting David's inappropriate behavior. Timothy's testimony would be crucial in ensuring David's conviction, but Bobby was taking no chances with his son's safety or well-being. Christine faced a different kind of reckoning. Bobby's hidden cameras had captured not just her affair with David, but also her willingness to prioritize their relationship over Timothy's welfare. The recordings showed Christine dismissing Timothy's complaints about David's behavior and even encouraging the boy to be nicer to the principal. For Bobby, this betrayal cut deeper than adultery. It was a fundamental violation of the sacred duty to protect their child. The confrontation between Bobby and Christine took place in their kitchen the morning after David's arrest. Bobby played the recordings methodically, watching Christine's face as she heard her own voice dismissing their son's fears and concerns. When the final recording ended, Christine looked up at Bobby with tears in her eyes and whispered, "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know what he was really after." Bobby's response was delivered with the cold precision of a judge pronouncing sentence. "You knew enough. You knew Timothy was uncomfortable. You knew David was asking inappropriate questions. You chose to ignore the signs because you were getting what you wanted from him. That makes you complicit in what he tried to do to our son." Christine's attempts to explain her actions only deepened Bobby's disgust. She spoke of feeling lonely and unappreciated, of David's attention making her feel valued and desired. Bobby listened without emotion, cataloging each excuse as further evidence of Christine's unfitness as a mother and wife. When she finished, Bobby delivered his ultimatum. Christine would leave their house immediately and would have no unsupervised contact with Timothy until the courts determined her fitness as a parent. The legal proceedings against David Morrison moved with surprising speed, aided by Bobby's meticulous evidence collection and Lisa's technical expertise. David's attorney attempted to claim entrapment, arguing that Bobby had illegally surveilled his client. But the recordings of David's threats toward Timothy made such defenses impossible to sustain. The predator had damned himself with his own words. Bobby's investigation into David's past had uncovered a network of previous victims spanning 3 states and nearly a decade. Working with Lisa and contacts in other jurisdictions, Bobby had systematically contacted these victims and their families, encouraging them to come forward with their experiences. The resulting avalanche of testimony painted a picture of a serial predator who had refined his techniques over years of practice. The media attention surrounding David's arrest and the revelation of his pattern of abuse made him a target for vigilante justice. Bobby neither encouraged nor discouraged these threats, but he made sure that David was aware of each one. Every day in jail, David received updates about his deteriorating situation, the loss of his pension, the seizure of his assets, and the complete destruction of his reputation. But Bobby's most devastating attack on David was personal rather than legal. Through careful research, Bobby had identified David's elderly mother in a nursing home in Indiana. The woman had no idea about her son's crimes and had been proud of his supposed success as an educator. Bobby arranged for her to receive copies of the court documents and news articles about David's arrest, ensuring that she understood exactly what her son had become. David's ex-wife, who had remained silent about the reasons for their divorce, was contacted by Bobby and encouraged to share her story with prosecutors. Her testimony revealed that David's inappropriate interest in children had been a factor in their marriage's failure, but she had been too afraid to come forward during their divorce proceedings. Bobby's investigation had given her the courage to finally speak the truth. The school district where David had been employed faced massive liability for their failure to properly vet his background and investigate previous complaints. Bobby had filed a civil lawsuit on Timothy's behalf, seeking not just monetary damages, but also complete reform of the district's hiring and supervision practices. The case had attracted attention from advocacy groups and promised to set precedents for how schools handle suspected predators. Christine's family turned against her when they learned the full scope of her betrayal. Bobby had systematically contacted her parents, siblings, and close friends, providing them with evidence of her affair and her failure to protect Timothy. The social isolation that resulted was complete and devastating, leaving Christine with no support system beyond the attorney Bobby had forced her to hire for the custody proceedings. Timothy's recovery was Bobby's primary concern throughout the legal and personal chaos. The boy was receiving counseling from specialists in childhood trauma, but his strongest source of healing was his father's unwavering presence and protection. Bobby had taken leave from the police department to focus entirely on his son's needs, ensuring that Timothy felt safe and loved despite the upheaval in their family. As David Morrison sat in his cell awaiting trial, he began to understand the full scope of Bobby Sinclair's vengeance. Every aspect of his life was being systematically destroyed by a man who had the skills, resources, and motivation to ensure that justice was not just served, but weaponized. The predator who had thought himself clever enough to manipulate a police detective's family was learning that some enemies are too dangerous to make. Chapter 8. The Final Hunt. 6 months after David Morrison's arrest, Bobby Sinclair had become a different man, harder, more focused, and utterly without mercy for those who had threatened his family. The legal proceedings against David were concluding successfully, but Bobby's personal campaign of vengeance was entering its final phase. David would soon discover that prison was only the beginning of his punishment. Timothy had made remarkable progress in his recovery, aided by specialized therapy and Bobby's constant presence. The 8-year-old had returned to school, a different school in a different district, and was showing signs of resilience that amazed his counselors. Most importantly, Timothy had maintained his trust in his father, understanding that Bobby had protected him when it mattered most. Christine's life had been comprehensively destroyed by the consequences of her choices. The custody hearing had been swift and decisive. Bobby had been granted full custody of Timothy, with Christine receiving only supervised visitation rights. Her teaching career was over, her reputation ruined, and her family relationships permanently damaged. She had moved to a small apartment across town and was working as a grocery store clerk to pay her legal fees. David Morrison's trial had been a media sensation, with testimony from multiple victims spanning his entire career. The evidence Bobby and Lisa had gathered proved David's guilt beyond any reasonable doubt, and the jury had convicted him on all charges. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, but Bobby's plans for him extended far beyond the legal system. Lisa Rodriguez had been promoted to detective sergeant, partly in recognition of her work on the Morrison case. She remained Bobby's closest ally in ensuring that David's punishment continued behind bars. Through their law enforcement contacts, they had arranged for David to be placed in a facility where his crimes against children would be well known to the general population. Bobby's investigation into David's financial affairs had uncovered hidden assets and offshore accounts that David had used to fund his predatory lifestyle. Working with federal agents, Bobby had ensured that every dollar was seized and redirected to victim compensation funds. David would leave prison with nothing but the clothes on his back, assuming he survived his incarceration. The nursing home where David's mother resided had received an anonymous donation sufficient to cover her care for the remainder of her life. Bobby had visited the elderly woman once, sitting with her as she wept over what her son had become. She had asked Bobby to forgive her for raising such a monster, and Bobby had quietly assured her that a parent could not be held responsible for their adult child's choices. David's ex-wife had remarried and moved to another state, finally free from the shadow of her association with a predator. Bobby had ensured that David's conviction would follow him wherever he went, making it impossible for him to rebuild his life after his release. Every employer, every landlord, and every person David tried to connect with would know exactly what he was. The school district had implemented sweeping reforms in response to the lawsuit Bobby had filed on Timothy's behalf. New background check procedures, mandatory reporting training, and victim advocacy programs were now in place across the entire system. The settlement money had been placed in a trust fund for Timothy's education and future needs. Bobby's return to active duty with the Chicago PD had been triumphant. His handling of the Morrison case had earned him commendations from the department and recognition from federal law enforcement agencies. More importantly, his colleagues now understood that Bobby Sinclair was not a man to be crossed. He would pursue justice with relentless determination regardless of personal cost. The house on Maple Street had been sold, and Bobby and Timothy had moved to a new home in a safer neighborhood. The fresh start had been therapeutic for both of them, allowing them to create new memories while leaving the trauma of David's infiltration behind. Timothy had chosen his new bedroom carefully, ensuring it had clear sight lines to all entrances and windows, a precaution Bobby supported completely. Christine's attempts to rebuild her relationship with Timothy had been largely unsuccessful. The boy understood that his mother had failed to protect him when he needed her most, and he was not ready to forgive that betrayal. Bobby had not prevented Christine from trying to reconnect with their son, but he had made it clear that Timothy's wishes would be respected above all other considerations. The final piece of Bobby's vengeance came in the form of a letter he sent to every person David had ever harmed. The letter detailed David's conviction and imprisonment, but more importantly, it provided contact information for a victim support network Bobby had helped establish. The message was clear. David Morrison's victims were no longer alone, and their abuser would never again have the power to hurt anyone. As Bobby sat in his home office one evening, reviewing the case files that had consumed his life for months, Timothy knocked on the door. The boy had grown taller and stronger in the aftermath of their ordeal, carrying himself with a confidence that belied his age. "Daddy," Timothy said, "Mr. Morrison will never hurt anyone again, will he?" Bobby pulled his son onto his lap and looked into eyes that held wisdom no child should possess. "No, Timothy. He'll never hurt anyone again. And if anyone ever tries to hurt you in the future, what will happen to them?" Timothy's response was delivered with absolute certainty. "You'll stop them, Daddy. You always protect me." Bobby hugged his son tighter and made a silent promise to himself and to every other potential victim David Morrison might have claimed. Some predators operated in darkness, counting on shame and silence to protect them, but they had never faced Detective Robert Sinclair, a man who understood that true justice sometimes required going beyond the law to ensure that monsters stayed in their cages forever. Chapter 9: Resurrection and Reckoning. 5 years had passed since David Morrison's conviction, and life had found a new rhythm for Bobby and Timothy Sinclair. The boy was now 13, excelling in school and showing early signs of his father's analytical mind. They had built a strong, trusting relationship founded on honesty and mutual respect. Bobby had never remarried, choosing instead to focus entirely on his son's development and his own career advancement. The call came on a Tuesday evening in October, the same month when their nightmare had originally begun. Bobby was reviewing case files when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was shaky and terrified. "Detective Sinclair? This is Warden Matthews at Millfield Federal Correctional Facility. I need to inform you that David Morrison was found dead in his cell this morning." Bobby's reaction was carefully controlled. He expressed appropriate concern and asked the relevant questions, but internally he felt only satisfaction. David's death in prison had been inevitable given his crimes and Bobby's careful orchestration of his placement among the general population. The warden explained that Morrison had been killed by fellow inmates who had learned about his crimes against children. Timothy was doing homework in the kitchen when Bobby ended the call. The boy looked up at his father's expression and immediately understood that something significant had happened. "Is it about Mr. Morrison, Dad?" Timothy asked with the directness that had become his trademark. Bobby sat down beside his son and explained that the man who had tried to hurt their family was dead. Timothy's response surprised Bobby with its maturity. "I'm glad he's dead, Dad. Not because I wanted him to suffer, but because now other kids will be safe." The 13-year-old had grown into a young man who understood justice and the necessity of protecting innocence. Bobby realized that his son had inherited not just his analytical abilities, but also his sense of moral clarity. Christine had attempted to re-establish contact with Timothy several times over the years, but the boy had consistently refused. Her supervised visitations had ended when Timothy turned 12 and could legally express his preference for no contact with his mother. Christine had moved to another state and remarried, but she sent birthday cards that Timothy threw away unopened. The revelation of David's death prompted Bobby to revisit the evidence he had collected during his investigation. Hidden in his home safe were recordings and documents that revealed the true scope of David's crimes. Evidence that had been too sensitive to present during the trial, but had informed Bobby's understanding of the predator's methods and victims. Among these files was a recording that Bobby had never shared with anyone, not even Lisa Rodriguez. It was David's confession, obtained during a conversation Bobby had with him in jail before the trial. David had admitted to crimes spanning decades, describing his victims with clinical detachment and expressing no remorse for the lives he had destroyed. The recording also contained David's threats against Bobby and Timothy, promises of future revenge that would never be fulfilled. David had been convinced that his connections and resources would eventually secure his freedom, and he had planned to make the Sinclair family pay for his prosecution. Bobby had listened to these threats with cold fury, understanding that David's death in prison had been the only way to ensure permanent safety for his son. Timothy's development into adolescence had been remarkably smooth despite the trauma of his early childhood. He had learned to trust his instincts about people, maintaining appropriate boundaries while forming healthy friendships. His counselors had consistently praised his emotional intelligence and resilience, noting that Bobby's protective presence had prevented lasting psychological damage. The boy had also developed an interest in law enforcement, often asking Bobby about his cases and expressing a desire to follow in his father's footsteps. Bobby encouraged this interest while ensuring that Timothy understood the full weight of such a career choice. The boy had seen firsthand what evil looked like, and he was determined to spend his life fighting it. Lisa Rodriguez had been promoted again and now headed the department's Special Victims Unit. She and Bobby remained close friends and professional allies, often consulting on cases involving crimes against children. Lisa had never married, claiming that her partnership with Bobby had set the standard too high for any romantic relationship to meet. The Sinclair house had become an unofficial sanctuary for other families dealing with similar traumas. Bobby's expertise in handling predator cases had made him a sought-after consultant, and his home often hosted support group meetings for parents whose children had been victimized. Timothy participated in these gatherings when appropriate, offering hope to younger victims through his own recovery. Christine's remarriage had produced a daughter, Timothy's half-sister whom he had never met. Christine had tried to use the child as leverage to re-establish contact with Timothy, but Bobby had made it clear that any relationship would depend entirely on Timothy's choice. The boy had shown no interest in meeting his mother's new family, viewing them as strangers who had no place in his life. The final piece of Bobby's long-term planning came to fruition on Timothy's 14th birthday. Bobby presented his son with a gift that represented both closure and preparation for the future: a complete set of self-defense training equipment and enrollment in advanced martial arts classes. Timothy would never again be helpless in the face of a predator. As they stood together in their backyard, installing the punching bag that would become central to Timothy's training routine, Bobby reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. He had lost a wife to betrayal and gained an unbreakable bond with his son. He had destroyed a predator and created a safer world for countless children. Timothy tested the bag with a solid punch that showed proper form and surprising power for his age. He looked at his father with eyes that held both determination and love. "Thanks, Dad, for everything. For protecting me, for teaching me, and for never giving up on what's right." Bobby placed his hand on his son's shoulder and spoke the words that had guided him through their darkest days. "That's what fathers do, Timothy. We protect our children, and we make sure the monsters stay in their cages. Sometimes we have to become monsters ourselves to do it, but we never forget why we're fighting." The sun set over their new life, casting long shadows across the yard where a boy had become a young man and a detective had become something more dangerous than any criminal he had ever hunted. David Morrison was dead, Christine was permanently exiled from their lives, and Timothy Sinclair was growing into a force for justice that would make his father proud. The resurrection of their family from the ashes of betrayal was complete, and Bobby knew that no predator would ever again threaten what he had built. He had learned that some battles could only be won by those willing to descend into darkness to retrieve the light, and he would do it again, without hesitation, if anyone dared to threaten his son. Detective Robert Sinclair had solved his most important case, the protection of his family, and the verdict was final. Timothy was safe, justice had been served, And the monsters would always fear the man who had proven that a father's love could be the most deadly weapon of all. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.